China is known for being the world's factory. Its economy is based on manufacturing cheap products that are then sold abroad. Toys, cell phones, tools, household appliances, all of them are the products that allow China to have one of the most booming economies in the world. Well, at least, that has always been the story that we've been told. But what if I told you that this story is false? What if I told you that the main driver of China's economy has nothing to do with manufacturing or even foreign trade? In fact, since the mid-2000s, the weight of exports in China has plummeted. Not only that, but many Western companies have started to leave the country to produce in other cheaper and safer places such as Vietnam or Malaysia. China is not what it used to be, and the famous Made in China is in the doldrums. But if this is so, if the factories are no longer the main activity, what is then? Or rather, what has been China's true economic driver in recent years? The answer is real estate. The Chinese real estate market, along with all of its related activities, now generates between 20 and 30% of the country's GDP. This is practically twice as much as in other places such as the United States, the European Union, or South Korea, and is undoubtedly the most booming sector in the Asian giant's economy by far. Real estate construction not only has had benefits in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of human welfare. For example, in the 1990s, the living space in Chinese urban areas was about 7 square meters per person. That's 75 square feet. People were basically living in small concrete closets. However, thanks to the growth of the sector, that space has grown to match that of other developed countries. In short, we could say that China has gone from being the world's factory to being a major builder of commercial buildings, housing, and all kinds of public infrastructure. Now, that's all well and good. It has created a lot of jobs and a lot of economic development over the last few years. Even so, I'm afraid to say that now, in 2023, this strategy could blow the entire country up.
China's bursting housing bubble will rock the economy for years.
Just a year and a half ago, a major real estate crisis broke out in China, a crisis that still continues to this day. This is something that many of you no doubt heard about in the news with the bankruptcy of the developer Evergrande. This crisis is turning out to be something like what happened in 2008 in Western countries, but with one big difference. In China, the real estate sector has become much more important than it was in the West. In other words, a crisis of this type in China is a crisis affecting its main economic driver. And, as you can imagine, this poses a serious systemic danger to global economic stability.
As China's property crisis grows, is the global economy at risk?
In this video, we will talk about the situation of the Chinese real estate crisis, its possible consequences, and above all, its causes. Because what if I told you that in reality, it was the Chinese government itself that caused this whole shambles? That's right, the Chinese government has caused its own crisis. But to understand all the details and to get right into the story, let's get cracking. To understand all the sides of this new Chinese crisis, there is a first key question that must be answered. And that question is, why has the Chinese real estate market become so large, even twice as large as in other countries? To find out the answer, we must travel back to 2008. At that time, China was at its peak as the world's factory. Its level of exports was almost double what it is today, and its factories were running at full steam ahead. However, as you all remember, that year the great financial crisis broke out in the West. Countries that used to buy Chinese products had massive economic problems, and because of that, they reduced their purchases in China. As a result, the Asian giant's economy suffered. They were no longer selling as much as before, and that was something that the government could not tolerate. The Chinese government was not going to allow its economy to go into recession, and therefore decided to step in and give the country an economic boost. And how did they do that? Well, by giving a huge boost to the real estate sector. More specifically, starting in 2008, the government increased housing loans, lowered interest rates, and provided all kinds of fiscal support for real estate development and promotion. In fact, this way of boosting the economy through the construction of real estate was commonplace in China for many years. It was only in 2008 that they went all in. And in the end, it was a pretty sensible way of doing politics. When it comes down to it, China was a country with a gigantic population and little housing, with growing urban centers and with a lot of companies developing. All of that requires a lot of housing, office, and infrastructure construction. Nevertheless, the truth is that the boost to the real estate market went far beyond good intentions. And what began as a way to improve the economy and people's lives ended up becoming a spiral of interests and perverse incentives. So, what was the reason? Well, stay tuned to find out.
The cycle of local speculation.
To understand the perverse incentives of the Chinese real estate system, we first need to understand how taxes work in China. You see, up until 1994, each region in China collected and spent taxes in a largely autonomous manner. The central government was mainly responsible for collecting taxes for common expenditures such as the military or foreign affairs, but it was the local institutions in each region that managed the bulk of the taxes. The problem is that this decentralized fiscal system weakened the control capacity of the central government, which in turn generated significant political concerns for the leaders in Beijing. To address this, in 1994, the Chinese government reformed the country's entire tax system and centralized it. From then on, the central government began to collect most of the taxes and then redistributed them to local organizations. However, this in turn caused another problem. Following the reform, local bodies continued to be responsible for most of the expenses such as health and education of the citizens, but of course, they depended on the central government to obtain the money to finance all of these expenses. So what was the conclusion? Well, local agencies found it very difficult to make new policies or carry out investments on their own. But there was one exception to this story. There was a way for local bodies to raise money on their own without having to deal with the government. Here, we are talking about land charges. Local institutions owned the land in the region, and one thing they could do was to sell the rights to use that land to real estate companies in order to build real estate. So, no sooner said than done. Local institutions started to bring in a lot of money by selling land to construction companies. But pay attention, because it doesn't end there. It turns out that the more expensive the price of housing in a region, the more money the real estate companies would pay for the land, and therefore the more money the local authorities could earn. And it was at this point that there was a cycle of local speculation which began. First, local agencies invested heavily in roads, hospitals, and infrastructure of all kinds. Thanks to these investments, more people wanted to live in regions with better infrastructure. This caused the price of housing to skyrocket, and along with it, the price of land. And all this, in the end, translated into more revenues for local bodies, which, once again, could invest in new infrastructure, returning to the beginning of the cycle. As you can see, the objective of the local agencies was very clear: to increase the price of housing by any means necessary. In fact, many of them began to cheat further, such as using state-owned companies to issue debt, buy land, and keep the money generated from the later sale. More specifically, some reports state that more than half of all land sold in Chinese cities was purchased by state-owned enterprises. So basically, the huge Chinese real estate boom was being manipulated from the beginning. In any case, that was not even the worst of it. The worst part of this whole story was in the real estate companies themselves.
He who goes to bed with debt ends up bankrupt.
To build the houses on their newly purchased land, the real estate companies needed money. Lots and lots of money. So where did that money come from? Well, mainly from two places. The first is the pre-sale of real estate. That is, the real estate companies sold houses long before they were built, and once they had sold them all, they began to build them with the money from the sales. This led many families to start paying mortgages on their homes even several years before they were actually able to live in them. In any case, the second way in which the real estate companies obtained the money needed to build was through loans from the financial system, mainly bank loans. To give you an idea, taking into account all debts, real estate companies currently have a debt to assets ratio of 80%. A real debacle. Practically the entire Chinese financial system is up to its neck in the real estate market. So, knowing all that we have just told you, we are sure that one crucial question has come up. Why did Chinese banks decide to lend so much money to the real estate market? Did they not learn the lesson of what happened in the West with the 2008 financial crash? Well, let's see. On the one hand, you have to take into account that the big Chinese banks belong to the government. And as we explained at the beginning of the video, since 2008, the government started to issue credit in a wild manner, using precisely its own banks. But on the other hand, many private banks that had no reason to rush into the real estate market were bought by real estate companies. Yes, that's right. Chinese real estate companies bought up entire banks in order to raise cheap money to finance their construction projects. For example, Evergrande, the well-known company that went bankrupt at the beginning of this crisis, bought part of a Beijing bank called Huaxia Bank, a full-fledged accumulation of power. However, it is clear that perverse incentives primed the real estate market. It is clear that the financial sector was up to its neck, but what actually triggered the crisis? What made the system explode so completely? Well, as we said at the beginning, the cause was the Chinese government itself. Check this out.
Orchestrating the disaster.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and in the case of the Chinese crisis, this is truer than ever. You see, back in 2020, China's government realized that the country's real estate market was over-indebted and overheated. So to avoid a financial crisis, they brought together the major real estate developers and asked them to do three things. The first was to reduce their debt levels to 70%. Second, they needed to have a capital cushion to withstand possible losses. And third, they would need to have enough cash to cover their short-term debts in a case of crisis. Basically, the government wanted the real estate companies to cut their huge amounts of debt. But to ensure that this happened, the government also cut off the types of cheap credit from banks to real estate developers and home buyers. By doing this, the government would not only reduce the debt, but also curb the excessive construction of new homes. Now then, remember that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the problem is that when the government implemented these new restrictions, coupled with the pandemic that slowed economic activity to a crawl, the result was that, overnight, home buying in China plummeted. And think about it, if housing sales plummet, real estate companies stop making money. And if they stop making money, who pays all those huge debts? Exactly, nobody.
China property giant Evergrande admits debt crisis as protesters besiege HQ.
To all this, there is one additional element to take into account. Do you remember that the real estate companies were in the habit of selling houses before building them? Well, when they ran out of money, they were unable to complete the construction of the homes they had already sold. As a result, many families were left without their homes, but had to continue paying their mortgages, and all of this without knowing if they would ever have the house they were promised. It was, as you can imagine, absolute chaos. The underlying problem of this whole story is not only that the real estate crisis could plunge the country into a serious recession, but also that it could end up destroying the entire financial system. The government wanted to avoid that possibility, and before the crisis developed further, it implemented a shock program with three key components. First, access to credit was re-established and facilitated for the real estate companies to avoid bankruptcy. Second, support was provided for the completion of half-built housing for families who had already taken on mortgages. And third, healthier real estate companies were encouraged to buy troubled companies and thus avoid their downfall. So, what was the outcome then? As a result, the government managed to halt the decline in the real estate market. In the first quarter of 2023, real estate investment practically stabilized, albeit still at very low levels. But does this mean that China managed to avoid the crisis? What exactly does the future hold for it? Well, Visualeconomik viewers, things are actually much worse than they seem.
Between the wall and the wallpaper.
It is true that, at least so far in 2023, the Chinese real estate market seems to have come to a standstill, neither getting better nor worse, and is kind of holding steady. Even so, several experts point out that this could be the calm before the real storm, and that the Chinese crisis still has a long way to go. On the one hand, the recovery from COVID may have already helped stem the crisis. After all, people were out and about again buying houses. But on the other hand, there are good reasons to believe that when this COVID recovery is over, the real estate crisis will unleash its full potential. So let's take a look at the clues that lead us to believe that the worst is actually yet to come. The first clue is that the number of empty houses in China is absolutely skyrocketing. It is true that countries like Spain and Italy surpass it, but in these two countries there are many vacation homes that are empty most of the time. However, in China, there are many empty houses simply because there are not enough people to occupy them, and many of the buildings are in rural areas that are losing population. Apart from this, another factor to consider is that home purchase prices compared to citizens' incomes are out of control in China, kind of like in the West. To give you an idea, in cities like Beijing or Shanghai, the price of a house is equivalent to 50 years of income for the average citizen. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, one of the most unaffordable cities in the US, the price does not even reach 10 years of income. So real estate prices in China are wildly disproportionate. So the question is, if there are not enough people to occupy all of the houses, but at the same time everyone has been building houses, how is it that the price has increased so much until now? The answer lies in real estate speculation. You see, unlike other countries, China does not have a highly developed stock or investment market. That is to say, people with money do not have such an easy time investing it in stocks or bonds as they do in places like the United States. So instead, they invest the money in the real estate market. In China, people buy real estate for speculative reasons, and that has contributed disastrously to the price escalation. But that is not the end of the story. Do you remember the cycle of speculation by local authorities? The collection strategy of these local institutions was to sell land, but there is a problem, and that is that the land is running out. This means means that overnight, many Chinese regional governments may lose a large amount of revenue. They will have trouble repaying their debts, and that could even collapse the country's social services, which, don't forget, are managed by local bodies and not by the central government.
A poor province in China splurged on bridges and roads. Now it's facing a debt reckoning.
In short, the real estate crash could be far worse than it has been. It could destroy the main economic driver, hit the financial sector, and bankrupt their governments. Not such a pleasant picture, is it? Yes, it is a pretty bleak outlook, to which, by the way, we must add one last factor. When banks start to give loans to real estate companies, they stopped giving money to companies in more productive sectors in the long term, such as the technology sector. This caused Chinese companies to have more problems growing and developing, and all to feed as much as possible to a real estate sector that is now on the verge of collapse. To put it another way, China not only fattened a monster that could tear it apart, but it also killed many companies in other sectors that now could have saved it from disaster. Although, as we always say at Visualeconomik, we don't have a crystal ball to see what will happen in the future. So we'll keep an eye on what unfolds. And for now, it's over to you. Do you think that the worst of the crisis is yet to come? Or do you think that the containment measures will manage to save the country? What would you do if you were the Chinese government? And above all, who do you think has been the main culprit in this whole affair? You can leave us your answers in the comments below. And if you like this video, please do like and subscribe to all of us here at Visualeconomik. Hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our videos, and catch up with us later. All the best. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.